The armory was alive with the restless energy of soldiers preparing for the night exercise. Metal clattered as rifles were slotted into racks. Boots echoed against the concrete floor, and the hum of nervous chatter filled the air. The place always smelled faintly of oil, gunpowder residue, and sweat, an aroma that, to most, spoke of repetition and routine. Major Daniel Reynolds leaned against the doorframe, hands clasped behind his back, scanning the room the way a chess player studies a board. He wasn't there to nitpick equipment checks or enforce regulations. The sergeants had that covered. His role was subtler. He observed his men and women in their unguarded moments, where nerves and habits revealed truths no file could capture. And that was when his gaze landed on her. Specialist Carter. She was a young soldier, no older than 24, standing at a bench near the far wall. She wasn't laughing with the others, wasn't fumbling with straps, or swearing under her breath at a jammed magazine. Instead, she adjusted her rifle with quiet precision, as though the world beyond the weapon barely existed. Every movement was measured, scope aligned, sling adjusted, magazine tapped twice against her palm before sliding home. It wasn't showy. It wasn't arrogant. But it was the kind of discipline Reynolds had seen in seasoned operators, not recruits with only a few training cycles behind them. The major tilted his head slightly. Something about her calm struck him. In an environment where most recruits were jittery before night ops, Carter seemed detached, steady, almost serene. But what truly caught his attention wasn't her demeanor. It was her gloves. They were black leather, worn but cared for, the kind issued years ago to special units before regulations standardized gear. At first glance, they looked ordinary. But when she shifted her grip, the fluorescent light overhead glinted across a faint design stitched into the knuckle. Reynolds' stomach tightened. It was a seal he hadn't seen in years, an insignia whispered about but officially erased. A skull half-shrouded in shadow. The Ghost Division. He blinked and narrowed his eyes, making sure his mind wasn't playing tricks. No, there it was. Subtle, barely visible, yet unmistakable to anyone who'd ever heard the stories. Reynolds straightened, pulling himself from the doorframe. He was careful not to let his expression change. If he walked over too quickly, if he let on that he noticed, it might tip her off. And something in his gut told him this wasn't a moment to handle rashly. He stayed in place watching. Carter continued her work, seemingly oblivious to the eyes on her. She checked her bolt carrier, wiped the edge with a cloth, then slid it back in place with an efficiency that didn't match her supposed years of service. Reynolds' thoughts wandered back to the whispers he'd heard years ago. The Ghost Division wasn't a unit you applied for. It wasn't a name printed on orders. It was something darker, built out of necessity during the height of overseas conflicts. Their missions were never acknowledged, their casualties never counted. Soldiers who joined never returned to rosters. Their families were told lies, their service buried beneath paperwork that led nowhere. And yet, here was a young soldier in his company, with their insignia stitched into her gloves. Why? Was it arrogance? A trophy taken from somewhere it didn't belong? Or worse, was she one of them? He thought about calling her over. A simple question could clear it up. But Reynolds had lived too long in the shadow of classified operations to believe in coincidences. If she was connected to that ghostly unit, pressing her too soon might close the door forever. Better to watch. To learn. Across the armory, soldiers laughed nervously as someone dropped a magazine, the metallic clang echoing. A sergeant barked at them, breaking up the moment. Carter didn't flinch. She slid her rifle onto the bench and began adjusting her sling with the same calm intensity. Reynolds studied her posture. Shoulders squared, but not stiff. Hands steady, no tremor, no wasted motion. The way she handled the weapon wasn't just practiced. It was ingrained, the way muscle memory builds only after real combat experience. He'd seen that kind of ease before in Afghanistan, watching Rangers and Special Forces strip rifles blindfolded during downtime, their hands moving like second nature. Carter had that same ease, but her file said otherwise. He remembered when she first arrived 2 months ago. A transfer from another base, paperwork so thin he could slide it into a single folder. The kind of file that made him raise an eyebrow, but not enough to flag up the chain of command. He'd chalked it up to bureaucratic oversight. Now, looking at her gloves, he wasn't so sure. The major's jaw tightened. Every instinct in him screamed that this wasn't normal. Soldiers didn't just happen to wear gear marked with the seal of a unit that officially didn't exist. And soldiers didn't carry themselves like that unless they'd been trained to do more than run drills and clean rifles. He stepped away from the doorframe, making a slow circuit of the room. His boots echoed lightly, drawing a few glances, but he kept his expression neutral. When he passed near Carter, he slowed just enough to let his gaze fall casually across her gloves again. Yes, the skull was there, almost invisible, but not to a trained eye. She noticed him then, not in the startled way of a recruit caught making a mistake, but with calm acknowledgement. Her eyes lifted briefly, locking on his, steady and unflinching, before returning to her rifle. Reynolds felt the faintest chill creep up his spine. That look wasn't the look of a soldier intimidated by rank. It was the look of someone assessing, measuring him the way he measured others. He moved on, keeping his pace even, refusing to let the unease show. The chatter of the armory washed over him again, but his focus remained on Carter. A ghost insignia on her gloves, a ghost of a past buried by command, and a soldier whose calm felt more like experience than discipline. Whatever her story was, Reynolds knew one thing. Carter wasn't here by accident. And sooner or later, he would have to find out why. The night air outside the armory carried a sharp bite, but inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed with a sterile hum that seemed to amplify every sound. Soldiers hustled, rifles checked and rechecked, boots tightened, helmets clipped into place. The upcoming exercise was nothing unusual, just another round of night maneuvers designed to test endurance and coordination. Major Reynolds should have been focused on the larger picture: timing, formations, potential weak links. But his thoughts kept circling back to Specialist Carter and the ghostly insignia on her gloves. He hadn't seen that symbol in years. He'd hoped never to see it again. The Ghost Division. He could still remember the first time he'd heard the name. It wasn't on paper, never in an official briefing. It was whispered by veterans late at night, usually after too much whiskey, their voices dropping low as if the shadows themselves might be listening. A unit formed out of desperation in the chaos of counterinsurgency. Unofficial, deniable, and frighteningly effective. But there had been stories. Stories of missions that didn't just cross moral lines, they erased them. Villages emptied overnight. Targets disappearing with no trace. Soldiers who came back different, if they came back at all. The ghosts were supposed to be gone, dismantled, buried so deep in the Pentagon's archives that even rumor would rot away. And yet, there it was. Their mark stitched faintly into Carter's gloves. Reynolds paced slowly along the row of benches, hands clasped behind his back in the posture of authority. To any observer, he was just a commanding officer supervising preparations. But his eyes kept drifting back toward Carter. She was standing now, adjusting the sling of her rifle across her shoulder. The movement was precise, almost ritualistic. Her face betrayed nothing, no nerves, no excitement, no chatter. Around her, the room vibrated with the restless energy of recruits, but she moved like still water, untouched by the current. Reynolds felt a nagging in his gut. He'd spent over 2 decades in uniform. He could read soldiers the way a mechanic reads an engine. He knew when someone was raw, when they were faking confidence, when they were carrying ghosts of their own. Carter didn't fit into any category he knew. She was too calm, too measured. And then there was that look she'd given him earlier. Brief, sharp, assessing. Not deferential. Not intimidated. It was the kind of look he'd only ever seen exchanged between operators in the field, the unspoken acknowledgement of equals. But she wasn't his equal. On paper, she was just a specialist with a thin service record and no combat tours. Reynolds stopped near the far end of the room, leaning against another bench, pretending to watch a cluster of soldiers argue over gear. But his thoughts churned. Could Carter actually be tied to the Ghost Division? It sounded insane. The program had been shut down, or at least, that's what everyone believed. If she was connected, what was she doing here? Why now? And more importantly, who had sent her? He let the question simmer as he drifted back toward her. Specialist Carter, he said casually, his tone even almost conversational. She snapped to attention, rifle at her side. Sir, Reynolds let his gaze fall briefly to the gloves, then back to her face. Those gloves? Where'd you get them? Carter's expression didn't change. Not a flicker. Issued, sir? Issued where? Reynolds pressed. Previous assignment. Her voice was calm, professional, almost rehearsed. What assignment was that? Fort Irwin, sir. Reynolds studied her eyes. Nothing. No shift. No hesitation. If she was lying, she was either very good at it or very used to it. Strange, Reynolds said, his tone deliberately mild. I haven't seen gloves like those in years. They're not standard issue anymore. Yes, sir. That insignia, he added, keeping his voice low, just for her. You know what it means? For the first time, there was the faintest pause. Not long, not enough for anyone else to notice, but to Reynolds, it was there. A flicker of calculation, a moment where she weighed her options. Then, no, sir. Just gloves. Reynolds let the silence stretch. He wanted to see if she would fill it. Most soldiers, under the weight of their commander's gaze, would start to ramble, to explain, to overcorrect. Carter didn't. She simply stood there, perfectly still, waiting. Finally, Reynolds nodded. Very well. Carry on. She inclined her head and turned back to her rifle, her hands steady as ever. Reynolds moved away, but his mind was anything but settled. He'd been around enough special operations veterans to know the signs. The calm, the precision, the ability to hold silence without flinching. That wasn't standard. That was trained, conditioned. And if Carter wasn't Ghost Division herself, then someone had gone to great lengths to make her look like she was. The major returned to the doorway, his eyes sweeping the room again. The soldiers were nearly ready, buzzing with energy, slapping helmets into place, checking straps. The exercise would begin soon. On the surface, everything was normal. But for Reynolds, normal had just been shattered. He couldn't shake the image of that insignia. A faded skull in shadow. A symbol not meant to exist. He thought of old comrades, men who had sworn the ghosts were real, who had muttered half-stories about blacked-out helicopters and missions scrubbed from memory. Men who drank too much because they'd seen too much. If Carter was connected to them, even in the smallest way, then the implications were staggering. It meant the ghosts hadn't been dismantled. It meant they were still out there, still moving in the dark, pulling strings. And now, for some reason, one of them, or something close to one of them, was here, in his company, under his command. The weight of that thought pressed on him like a stone. He knew he couldn't confront her openly, not yet. The wrong word, the wrong move, could bring scrutiny from levels above him that he didn't want to invite. But he also knew This wasn't something he could ignore. As the soldiers filed out into the night, Carter among them, Reynolds followed, his expression carefully neutral. The training exercise was about to begin. On the surface, it would be a routine night operation. But for Reynolds, the real mission had already started. He needed answers. And Specialist Carter, quiet, calm, and carrying the mark of the Ghost Division, was the key to finding them. The exercise had begun. Soldiers fanned out across the mock village, their shapes cutting through shadows under the pale wash of moonlight. Blanks cracked through the air, smoke drifted from charges planted along the dirt road, and instructors barked into radios. For the men and women of Bravo Company, this was another test of endurance, of learning to fight as a unit. For Major Reynolds, it was background noise. His attention kept slipping away from the chaos in front of him, and back to the insignia he'd seen on Carter's gloves. The Ghost Division. Even the name carried weight. It was never spoken casually, never written in official reports. It belonged to the shadows of memory, to the edges of conversations where soldiers leaned closer, lowering their voices like children, whispering ghost stories around a fire. Reynolds had first heard about them in Kandahar, years ago. A sergeant, drunk on contraband whiskey, had muttered about a squad that operated without insignia, without orders anyone could trace. They weren't Rangers. They weren't Delta. They weren't even on the books, the man had said, his voice slurring but steady enough to carry conviction. They were something else. Something we weren't supposed to know about. At the time, Reynolds had laughed it off. Every war zone bred its legends. Phantom units, secret weapons, miracle snipers who never missed. But the more tours he survived, the more whispers he heard. Whispers that painted a consistent, unnerving picture. The Ghost Division had no patch, no banner, no glory. They were the soldiers sent when deniability was more important than victory. They went where regular units couldn't, did what conventional command wouldn't dare authorize. And they never returned to tell their stories. Reynolds remembered one particular night, sitting on the hood of a Humvee with Captain Martinez, watching tracer fire arc across the horizon. Martinez had spoken in that same hushed tone, eyes locked on the distance. They hit a convoy last year, Martinez said. Taliban leaders. Wiped them out before the locals even knew they were there. Bodies disappeared. No wreckage. You didn't hear about it on the news because there wasn't anything left to report. And you think it was these ghosts? Reynolds asked, skeptical. Martinez had just nodded. Saw one once. Passing through the fob. Eyes like he wasn't even alive anymore. Like he'd left part of himself out there in the sand. That had been years ago. Yet the memory lingered, rising unbidden now, as Reynolds watched Carter maneuver through the training course. She was calm, deliberate, her movements sharp and economical. No wasted steps, no flinches when charges exploded nearby. She moved like someone who had seen real fire, real death, and survived it. The whispers played in his head, layering over her presence. Some said the ghosts were recruited from the best operators handpicked for skill, loyalty, and an unusual tolerance for the kind of missions others refused. Others swore they weren't recruited at all, but created, molded from broken soldiers, willing to trade their past lives for new identities. There were darker rumors, too. Stories that the ghosts were pushed beyond human limits, drug trials, psychological conditioning, isolation so deep it cracked their minds and rebuilt them into something else. Something less than human, or more, depending on who you asked. And when the wars wound down, when oversight threatened to shine a light, the program had supposedly vanished. No deactivation ceremony, no public acknowledgement. Just a slow erasure, files disappearing, names scrubbed from memory. But Reynolds knew enough about the military machine to recognize the truth. Nothing ever really vanished. Projects like that didn't end. They went underground, waiting for the next time someone decided they were necessary. And now standing in his company, wearing their gloves, was Specialist Carter. He couldn't decide which possibility unsettled him more, that she really was one of them, or that someone wanted him to believe she was. The crack of simulated gunfire snapped him back. Through his binoculars, he tracked Carter's position. She moved with uncanny precision, signaling 2 recruits to flank left while she advanced through cover. They obeyed without hesitation, as though she carried authority far beyond her rank. Reynolds lowered the binoculars, jaw tight. It was one thing to hear stories of the Ghost Division in dusty tents overseas, but it was another to see their ghostly fingerprints alive in the present. Later, after the exercise ended, and soldiers trudged back to the armory, sweaty and exhausted, Reynolds lingered outside the command tent, listening to the chatter. Most recruits complained about the ambushes, the smoke, the fatigue. But one name kept surfacing, spoken with grudging respect. Carter knew exactly where to move. She didn't even look scared. Man, she called those shots like she'd done it before. Reynolds felt the unease deepen. It wasn't just him noticing. Even her peers sensed she was different. Inside the tent, Captain Donovan approached him with a clipboard, still running through reports. Performance was mixed, sir. Lot of the kids need work on communication. But that Carter, she's something else. Natural instincts. Reynolds forced a neutral nod. Noted, but his thoughts were anything but neutral. Natural instincts. That was the phrase commanders always used when they couldn't explain experience. And instincts like Carter's didn't come from drills on U.S. soil. They came from real operations, from surviving situations where a wrong step meant death. When the debrief ended, Reynolds dismissed the unit and walked alone toward his quarters. The base was quiet now, the desert night stretching endless and black around the perimeter fences. Crickets chirped in the distance, and somewhere a generator hummed steadily. He paused beneath the stars, the cold settling into his bones. The Ghost Division. He could almost hear the old whispers, could almost see the haunted eyes of the men who had sworn the unit was real. They'd spoken like men confessing sins they couldn't absolve, burdened by truths too heavy to carry alone. And now, decades of silence later, their seal had appeared on a young soldier's gloves. Reynolds clenched his fists. Whatever Specialist Carter was, whatever story lay behind those gloves, he knew it wasn't coincidence. The Ghost Division's shadow had stretched into his command, and he would either uncover the truth, or it would swallow him whole. The debrief room was colder than usual, its fluorescent lights casting a harsh white over the concrete walls. Major Reynolds sat at the head of the long table, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands, though he hadn't taken a sip. The soldiers filtered in slowly, dropping into metal chairs, some slouching, others sitting rigid with the weight of fatigue. Reynolds didn't look at most of them. His eyes were on Specialist Carter. She entered without hesitation, helmet tucked under one arm, rifle slung across her back, gloves still on her hands. The same gloves. The same faint insignia stitched like a ghost into the leather. She moved to her seat with quiet efficiency. No wasted steps, no glance around the room as if seeking approval. She was invisible, and yet Reynolds couldn't look away. The session began like any other. Soldiers were called to report on what went wrong, what went right, how they'd improve. Reynolds listened, nodding, occasionally interjecting with pointed corrections. But all the while, he was waiting for his moment. When the last recruit finished, he leaned back in his chair and let the silence settle over the room. Soldiers fidgeted. Chairs squeaked. The tension thickened. Then his gaze locked on Carter. "Specialist Carter," he said, his tone calm but edged with authority. "Step forward." She rose immediately, boots clicking against the concrete as she moved to the front of the room. She stood at attention, chin high, eyes forward. You performed differently tonight, Reynolds said. Yes, sir. Her voice was level, clipped, the answer of a soldier giving respect without elaboration. You moved through that course like you'd done it before. Flanking maneuvers, signaling without radios, clearing corners without hesitation. That's not standard training. Where'd you learn that? Training, sir. Training? His eyebrow arched. At Fort Irwin? Yes, sir. Reynolds let the pause stretch. He sipped his coffee, watching her. She didn't twitch, didn't fidget, didn't glance away. Funny, he said finally, setting the cup down. I've seen plenty of soldiers from Fort Irwin. None of them moved like you did. She didn't respond. She didn't even blink. He leaned forward slightly. You want to tell me the truth, specialist? The truth, sir? Yes, about where you learned to fight like that. Her expression didn't change. With respect, sir, I learned it here. In training. Reynolds studied her, searching for cracks. Most soldiers betrayed themselves eventually. A darting eye, a tremor in the voice, a shifting stance. Carter gave him nothing. She was a statue in uniform, her calm as deliberate as her movements in the field. The silence grew heavier. Around them, the other soldiers shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another. They could feel it too, that something was happening here, something they weren't supposed to witness. Reynolds finally dismissed the rest of the company. Out, all of you. Chairs scraped against concrete as boots shuffled toward the door. The soldiers filed out quickly, their whispers swallowed as the heavy metal door shut behind them. Now it was just Reynolds and Carter, the air thick with unspoken tension. He stood, walking slowly around the table, circling her like a predator measuring prey. Those gloves, he said, his voice lower now. Where did you get them? Her eyes flicked toward him briefly, then back forward. Issued, sir. I've already checked. They're not standard issue. Not anymore. Not for years. No response. That insignia, he pressed. You know what it means? This time, the silence stretched longer. Not long enough to betray her, but enough for Reynolds to feel the weight of it. She was calculating, choosing her words carefully. Finally, no, sir. Just gloves. Reynolds stopped in front of her, close enough to see the tiny imperfections in the stitching, the faint fray along the cuff. His voice dropped even lower. Don't lie to me, specialist. You think I don't recognize it? You think I don't know what I'm looking at? Her jaw tightened. A flicker. Barely visible, but it was there. Reynolds felt a small surge of satisfaction. He had touched a nerve. He pressed harder. You don't just stumble into gear like that. Someone gave it to you. Someone who wanted you to wear it. Now you're going to tell me who. Carter finally looked at him, her eyes steady, her voice quiet but firm. With respect, sir, I can't answer that. Can't or won't. Doesn't matter, sir. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Not disrespectful, not rebellious, but immovable. Reynolds studied her face. She wasn't being defiant. She wasn't even trying to cover her tracks. She was simply refusing to speak. Silence as armor. Silence as a weapon. He exhaled slowly, leaning back. He'd interrogated enemy combatants with less composure than this. Most cracked eventually. Carter seemed unbreakable. For a long moment, the only sound was the buzz of the fluorescent lights above. Finally, Reynolds spoke again, his tone softer now. You understand what this means, don't you? You walk around with that insignia, people will notice. People like me. People who ask questions you may not want to answer. Yes, sir. And yet you still wear them. Yes, sir. He shook his head, a humorless smile tugging at his mouth. You're either reckless, specialist, or you know you're untouchable. She didn't respond. Reynolds turned away, pacing slowly back toward his chair. His mind churned. This wasn't just silence. This was discipline of a kind rarely seen outside special operations, discipline drilled deep, the kind born from training that stripped soldiers of everything but mission and survival. He sat again, rubbing his temples briefly before looking back at her. Dismissed. Carter saluted sharply, turned, and walked out of the room without a word. When the door shut behind her, the silence that remained was deafening. Reynolds sat in the empty room for a long time, staring at the gloves burned into his memory. He had tried to break her silence and failed. And in that failure, he'd learned something more dangerous than any admission. Specialist Carter wasn't just hiding something. She was trained to hide everything. Her silence wasn't ignorance. It was intention. And whatever she was protecting, it was bigger than him. The following morning, Major Reynolds sat alone in his office, the blinds half drawn against the rising sun. The base was already alive outside, boots marching on gravel, vehicles rumbling to life, the distant bark of a drill sergeant snapping recruits into formation. But in his office, the world narrowed to a manila folder lying on his desk. Specialist Carter's file. It was thinner than any service record he'd seen in 2 decades of command. Most soldiers carried a small history with them, photographs from boot camp, certificates from schools, notes from evaluations. The kind of paper trail that proved they were real, that they'd lived and trained and failed and improved along the way. Carter's file, by contrast, felt like it had been constructed, not accumulated. Reynolds flipped through the pages slowly, his brow furrowing. Basic intake form. Height, weight, blood type. Clinical, sterile. A single signature at the bottom, the scrawl barely legible. No family information, just a line. Next of kin. Classified. Training records. Fort Irwin, 6 months. No photographs. No notes from instructors. Just a typed statement, completed satisfactorily. Assignments, listed as support detail, at 2 different bases, both entries with dates but no annotations. No commendations. No reprimands. Nothing in between. It was all too neat. Too clean. Reynolds leaned back in his chair, staring at the thin stack of papers. He knew the military bureaucracy. Nothing was ever this tidy. Files collected scars the way soldiers collected them. Stray notes, fingerprints of personalities, moments where the machine recorded its friction with human reality. But Carter's record had no scars. It was smooth, polished, almost surgical. He flipped back again to her intake form. The date of enlistment was correct for her age, but the paperwork trailed before it was conspicuously absent. No school records. No prior addresses. Not even a hometown listed. Reynolds muttered under his breath. That's impossible. Even soldiers who wanted to disappear couldn't erase everything. The system always left crumbs. A dental record here, a driver's license there, even a traffic ticket tucked away in some county court. But Carter's file had none of it. It was as if she had simply materialized in uniform, fully formed, 6 months before stepping into his command. He reached for the phone, dialing the personnel office. After a few rings, Sergeant Wilkins answered, her voice brisk. "This is Wilkins. Sergeant, it's Reynolds. I need you to pull deeper on Specialist Carter's background. Everything you can find, training evaluations, school files, disciplinary notes, the works." There was a pause on the other end. "Sir, we already sent you her full file." "I know what you sent me," Reynolds said, keeping his tone even. "I want everything else. Back-channel it if you have to. There's more out there." Another pause. "Sir, with respect, I've already checked. What you have is the full file. There's nothing else." Reynolds frowned. "That doesn't make sense." "I know, sir. But I ran it twice. Same results. Her records, bare, too bare. Like it was scrubbed. Scrubbed? Yes, sir. Like someone went through and cut out the details. Clean. Purposeful. Reynolds exhaled slowly. His suspicion hardened into certainty. Someone had engineered this. Thank you, Sergeant, he said finally. That'll be all. He hung up and sat in silence, staring at the file as though it might give him answers if he looked long enough. Instead, the emptiness inside it stared back, heavier than any stack of papers could be. He thought about the Ghost Division again. The stories of soldiers whose names had been erased, their records purged as though they'd never existed. This was exactly what those old rumors had described. But why Carter? Why now? The door creaked open. Captain Donovan stepped in, holding a clipboard. Sir? Briefing in 20 minutes. Reynolds waved him in, motioning for him to sit. Donovan dropped into the chair opposite, setting the clipboard down. Quick question, Reynolds said, sliding Carter's file across the desk. You've worked with her closely. What's your take? Donovan flipped the folder open, scanning the thin contents before shrugging. She's sharp, quiet, doesn't draw attention. But when the bullets start flying, even blanks, she's the calmest in the field. The others follow her lead, even though she's not supposed to be leading. That doesn't bother you? Reynolds asked. Donovan chuckled softly. Honestly, sir, it's refreshing. Half these kids fall apart under pressure. Carter, she doesn't blink. If anything, I'd say she's underranked. She acts like she's been doing this for years. Reynolds nodded slowly. Exactly what he feared. And her file doesn't strike you as unusual? Donovan closed the folder and set it back on the desk. Unusual? Sure, but I've seen it before. Sometimes people slip through cracks. Maybe she lost records in a system crash. Maybe she got caught in the shuffle of transfers. Doesn't always mean anything sinister. Reynolds didn't reply. He didn't believe in coincidences, not when it came wrapped in the insignia of the Ghost Division. When Donovan left, Reynolds opened the file one more time. His eyes landed on the photograph stapled to the intake form. It was grainy, low resolution, clearly taken during processing. Carter's face was expressionless, eyes flat, lips pressed in a neutral line. A face that revealed nothing. It reminded him of intelligence photos he'd seen in classified briefings, faces stripped of context, meant only to confirm existence, not identity. Reynolds closed the folder and locked it in his desk drawer. He knew then that Carter wasn't a mistake. She wasn't an oversight. She was a deliberate insertion, placed here for reasons he didn't yet understand. And whoever had erased her past had done it with surgical precision. That night, he sat alone in his quarters, staring at the ceiling. Sleep refused to come. The base outside was quiet, the desert night stretching infinite and silent. But his thoughts churned relentlessly. If Carter was tied to the Ghost Division, then she wasn't just another soldier under his command. She was a message, a warning, or worse, the opening move in a game he hadn't realized he was playing. And Reynolds knew one thing with absolute certainty. In a game like that, silence was never empty. Silence was strategy. Carter's past didn't match her records because her past wasn't meant to be found. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized. Maybe it wasn't just her past that had been erased. Maybe his own future was already being rewritten. The desert stretched wide and silent under the noonday sun. Heat shimmered off the sand, distorting the horizon until the mountains looked like mirages. It was supposed to be a controlled exercise. Blue team versus red team, mock engagement with blanks, drones overhead tracking every movement. Nothing dangerous. Nothing unexpected. At least, that was the plan. Major Reynolds stood on a ridge, binoculars pressed to his eyes. He watched his unit move cautiously through the crumbling ruins of an old training village, burned-out shells of buildings left from decades of war simulations. Captain Donovan led the blue team forward, Carter moving near the rear, rifle ready, scanning corners with methodical precision. She didn't move like a follower. She moved like someone who saw everything, every blind spot, every potential ambush. Reynolds lowered the binoculars, muttering to himself. She's running the show without running the show. Beside him, a radio operator adjusted his headset. "Sir, red team's closing in from the east. They'll make contact in less than 2 minutes." Reynolds raised the binoculars again. The red team soldiers role-playing as hostiles were indeed converging, weaving through alleys, ready to spring the ambush. On paper, the exercise was stacked against the blue team. They should take heavy losses before regrouping. That was the point, to teach them how to recover from surprise. But then Reynolds saw Carter pause. She tilted her head slightly, like she'd caught a sound no one else had. She raised a fist, signaling a halt. Donovan glanced back, confused, but Carter didn't wait for permission. She darted to a side alley, scanning the rooftops. "Sir," the radio operator said, frowning. "She's breaking formation." Reynolds didn't answer. His pulse quickened. He watched through the lenses as Carter dropped to one knee, gesturing in a series of hand signals that weren't standard Army protocol. And yet the soldiers near her responded instinctively, adjusting positions, covering angles. Seconds later, the red team sprung their ambush only to walk directly into overlapping fields of fire. The blue team unleashed controlled bursts of blanks, cutting the red team down before they even reached cover. Within 30 seconds, the ambush collapsed. The red team scattered, trying to regroup, but Carter had already shifted her squad, flanking with surgical precision. What should have been a brutal loss for the blue team turned into a flawless victory. Reynolds lowered the binoculars, his mouth tightening. This wasn't improvisation. This was doctrine-advanced tactics he'd only seen practiced by special operations units. The kind of maneuvers drilled into soldiers who operated behind enemy lines, where hesitation meant death. The radio operator whistled under his breath. "Sir, how the hell did she see that coming?" Reynolds didn't answer. He couldn't. Minutes later, the after-action horn blared across the desert, signaling the end of the exercise. Soldiers trudged back toward the staging area, sweat soaking their uniforms. Donovan's face was a mix of pride and disbelief as he debriefed his squad, congratulating them on their performance. But Carter said nothing. She stood slightly apart, helmet under her arm, gloves still on her hands, eyes scanning the horizon as if the exercise wasn't really over. Reynolds descended from the ridge, boots crunching on gravel. The soldiers stiffened when they saw him approach. He ignored them all except Carter. "Specialist," he said sharply. "With me." She fell into step beside him without hesitation. They walked in silence until they reached the edge of the staging area, away from the others. Reynolds turned on her, his voice low but hard. "That wasn't luck. You don't just guess an ambush like that." Carter met his eyes, unflinching. "No, sir." "Then explain it." She hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. "Then, experience, sir." Reynolds' jaw tightened. "Experience you're not supposed to have." Again silence. She didn't deny it. She didn't admit it. She just stood there, every muscle disciplined into stillness. Reynolds stepped closer, lowering his voice further. "You moved those soldiers like a unit you've led 100 times. That's not specialist work. That's ghost work." The name hung in the air between them. For the first time, Carter's eyes flickered just barely, but enough. A shadow of recognition, of weight. Reynolds felt it like a confirmation. He had cornered the truth. "Who are you, really?" he demanded. Carter's lips parted slightly, as if she might answer. But then she shut her mouth, her expression flattening again. "Specialist Carter, sir," she said softly. It was a wall. The same wall she'd built every time he pressed her. Reynolds exhaled through his nose, frustrated but oddly impressed. Most soldiers would have cracked under the pressure of direct accusation. Carter only reinforced her silence, using it like armor. But the silence itself spoke volumes. That night, the barracks buzzed with talk. Soldiers whispered about Carter's uncanny instincts, about how she'd turned the exercise on its head. Some joked that she had a sixth sense. Others said she cheated, that she must have had intel no one else did. But the whispers all carried the same undertone. She wasn't like the rest of them. Reynolds sat alone in his office, replaying the day's events in his mind. The way she had signaled with unfamiliar gestures. The way her squad had responded instinctively, as if they had trained together for years. That wasn't chance. That was conditioning. He poured himself a glass of water, staring at the map on the wall. He had seen this before: patterns of movement, precision under fire, the uncanny ability to anticipate threats before they materialized. Carter wasn't learning on the job. She was remembering. And if she was remembering, then the Ghost Division wasn't just a story. It was real. And it was walking his base in specialist rank, hiding in plain sight. For the first time in years, Reynolds felt a flicker of something he rarely admitted to himself: unease. Major Reynolds stared at the phone for a long time before dialing. He had rehearsed the call in his head all night, turning over the words like pieces of a puzzle. Now, in the quiet of his office, he dialed the secure line to Division Command. The call connected after 3 rings. A clipped voice answered. "Operations. This is Major Reynolds," he said, his voice steady but sharp. "I need to discuss a personnel matter." "Specialist Carter, Bravo Company." There was a pause. The operator's voice came back flat. "Hold, Major." The line clicked. Silence stretched. Reynolds leaned back, his hand tightening on the receiver. After nearly 2 minutes, another voice cut in deeper, older, carrying the weight of rank. "This is Colonel Hastings. What's your issue with Specialist Carter?" Reynolds cleared his throat. "Sir, her file is incomplete. Scrub it even. No prior records, no family information, no training notes. Yesterday, during the live exercise, she demonstrated tactics well beyond her pay grade. Advanced maneuvers. Special operations level. I believe she may be connected to." He hesitated. Saying the words out loud felt like pulling a ghost into daylight. "To the Ghost Division." There was a long silence on the other end. Too long. Finally Hastings spoke, his tone icy. "You're mistaken, Major. There is no such unit." "With respect, sir, I've seen the insignia myself." "On her gloves?" Another pause. Then the colonel's voice dropped lower. "Major Reynolds, you've been in the Army long enough to know when to stop asking questions. Do I make myself clear?" Reynolds sat up straighter. "Sir, with respect, if she's operating under false identity, it's a threat to this command. To my men." "You are out of your lane, Major," Hastings snapped. "You will treat Specialist Carter as any other soldier. You will not pursue this matter further. And you will not repeat what you just said to anyone. Understood?" Reynolds' jaw tightened. "Sir, understood." The silence on Reynolds' end stretched, heavy and dangerous. He finally forced the word out. "Understood." The line went dead. Reynolds sat there, the receiver still pressed to his ear, the dial tone humming. His heart pounded. He had expected resistance, maybe even bureaucratic stonewalling. But the colonel's reaction was more than that. It wasn't denial, it was warning. And warnings only came when someone was hiding something worth protecting. That afternoon, Reynolds walked the base like a man haunted. His soldiers greeted him in passing, unaware of the storm churning inside their commander. Carter moved among them like a shadow, blending seamlessly, her silence unshaken. But to Reynolds, she stood out more than ever. When evening came, he poured himself a coffee and sat alone in the mess hall long after it closed. He replayed Hastings' words in his head. "You will not pursue this matter further." But Reynolds wasn't built to obey silence. He reached out to an old friend, instead Major Susan Keller, a former intelligence officer, now buried deep in Pentagon logistics. He trusted her more than most. When her voice answered on the secure line, it carried warmth he hadn't realized he needed. "Reynolds, been too long. What's the emergency?" He hesitated. "Sue, you ever hear of personnel files being scrubbed clean? Not just light, but surgically erased?" Keller paused. "Yes, once, when I was in DA, we had operators whose records didn't exist on paper. Not officially." "What kind of operators?" "The kind you don't talk about. Not on phones. Not anywhere." Reynolds' grip on the receiver tightened. "So I'm not crazy." "Crazy? No? Reckless? Maybe. Who are we talking about?" He lowered his voice. "Specialist Carter. Bravo Company." Keller sucked in a sharp breath. "Reynolds, I shouldn't even say this, but if that name's tied to what I think it is, you need to drop it. Now. I can't. She's under my command. That doesn't matter. If she's what I think she is, she's not really under anyone's command. You push this, and you won't just lose your post. You'll lose your clearance, your career, maybe more." Reynolds stared at the dark window across from him, his own reflection glaring back. "I can't just ignore it, and at least be smart. Watch her. Don't confront. Don't dig through channels. And for God's sake, don't put it in writing. Understand?" Reynolds closed his eyes. Understood. When the call ended, he sat in silence. His coffee had gone cold, untouched. The next day, Reynolds tested the waters carefully. He pulled Donovan aside during morning prep. "Tell me," Reynolds asked casually, "you ever notice anything off about Carter?" Donovan smirked. "Off? You mean besides the fact she's the best soldier in the company? She doesn't complain, doesn't miss shots, doesn't panic. If anything, the others look up to her more than me. That doesn't strike you as odd?" "Odd? No. Lucky?" "Absolutely," Donovan chuckled. "I'll take 10 more like her if you've got them." Reynolds didn't laugh. His stomach tightened. Donovan couldn't see what he saw. Maybe he wasn't supposed to. That night, Reynolds returned to his office. He unlocked his drawer, pulling Carter's file back out. Thin, empty, deceptive. But this time, he noticed something he'd overlooked before. A faint watermark on one of the training documents, visible only when the page caught the desk lamp at the right angle. It wasn't a base seal. It wasn't Army standard. It was the same ghost insignia he had seen on her gloves. His throat went dry. The seal was real, and it was official enough to be burned into paper hidden in plain sight. Reynolds shoved the file back into the drawer, locking it tight. His pulse thundered in his ears. This wasn't just about Carter anymore. This was about the Army itself, about an entire shadow stitched into its fabric. For the first time in his career, Major Reynolds realized he wasn't the one pulling the strings. He was the one being watched. The base felt different after the discovery of the watermark. For Major Reynolds, every shadow seemed sharper, every silence heavier. He noticed the way soldiers paused mid-sentence when Carter walked past, how their whispers cut short the moment she entered a room. She wasn't trying to draw attention, she never had, but now he saw the subtle gravity she carried. A quiet authority. She wasn't just another specialist. She was something else entirely. And Reynolds knew someone, somewhere, was watching him just as closely. 2 days later, a convoy drill was staged in the desert routine training, nothing unusual. Reynolds rode in the lead Humvee, eyes scanning the horizon. The desert stretched endless in every direction, an ocean of heat and dust. Halfway through the route, the first explosion hit. The Humvee jolted violently, smoke billowing from its hood as the vehicle behind them erupted in flames. Pyrotechnics, controlled detonations planted by instructors for the exercise. But this wasn't scheduled. Reynolds hadn't signed off on any lev blast scenario. Contact front. A soldier shouted. Blanks erupted, peppering the convoy as Red Team role players appeared from hidden positions. But something was wrong. Their movements weren't the sloppy theatrics of training. They were coordinated, sharp, professional. Ambush. Donovan barked, rallying the men. Reynolds grabbed his rifle, ducking low. He scanned the chaos. Soldiers scrambled for cover, trading fire with unseen aggressors. And then he saw her Carter. She wasn't panicked. She wasn't confused. She was moving with precise efficiency, directing soldiers with clipped gestures, flanking without hesitation. She returned fire only when necessary, conserving ammo, eyes scanning patterns the others couldn't even perceive. And then, with a sudden pivot, she sprinted into the open, dragging a wounded recruit behind cover with strength and speed far beyond her slight frame. Reynolds watched, stunned. She wasn't reacting. She was anticipating. Every move, every decision, as though she had lived this exact scenario 100 times before. "Sir," Donovan shouted. "Orders?" Reynolds hesitated. His men looked to him for direction, but the truth hit him with brutal clarity. Carter was already running the fight. He gave the only order that made sense. "Follow Carter." The squad shifted around her instantly. With Carter guiding them, the ambush collapsed in minutes. Red Team aggressors were neutralized, their lines broken, their attempt shattered. The smoke cleared, leaving silence over the desert. Reynolds lowered his rifle, his pulse still hammering. He looked across the sand. Carter stood at the center of the squad, calm as always, gloves dark with dust and sweat. Her eyes met his across the distance. And for the first time, Reynolds didn't see a specialist. He saw a ghost. The after-action report was a storm. Command summoned Reynolds within hours. He sat stiff-backed in the conference room as Colonel Hastings' face filled the secure monitor. "Major," Hastings said, voice clipped, "explain to me why your unit deviated from training protocol." "With respect, sir, it wasn't training protocol. That was a real ambush. Whoever set it up, they weren't playing with blanks." Hastings' expression didn't shift. "That's not your concern." "The hell it isn't," Reynolds snapped before he could stop himself. "Those were my men out there. My responsibility. You kept them alive," Hastings said flatly. "That's all that matters." Reynolds leaned forward. "This was orchestrated, wasn't it? A test for her." Silence. Hastings' jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. "Who is she?" Reynolds demanded. "You don't want to know, Major." "I already do." The colonel's gaze hardened. "Then let me make this simple. Carter is not your problem. She never was. If you value your command, your career, and your men, you will stop asking questions. You will submit your reports as written, no deviations. You will treat her as just another specialist. Do you understand?" Reynolds' fists clenched under the table. "And if I don't?" Hastings leaned closer to the camera, his voice low and lethal. "Then you'll learn what it feels like to be erased, Major, just like her." The feed cut abruptly, leaving only static. That night, Reynolds sat alone in his quarters, the weight of the choice crushing him. His instincts screamed at him to fight, to expose the truth. But he knew Hastings wasn't bluffing. The Ghost Division didn't play with threats. He poured a drink, staring at the amber liquid. For the first time in his life, he questioned whether truth was worth more than survival. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. "Enter," he called. The door opened. Carter stepped in, gloves still on her hands. She closed the door quietly behind her, then stood at attention. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" Reynolds nodded. "I know you've been asking questions," she said softly. "About me." Reynolds swallowed hard. "And?" Her gaze didn't waver. "Stop." The word landed like a command, though her tone was calm. "You don't understand," Reynolds said, his voice low. "If I stop, then I become part of it. Complicit." Carter shook her head. "If you don't stop, you won't have the chance to be complicit. You'll be gone. Your men will lose you. That's the cost." Reynolds studied her face. For the first time, he saw something in her eyes, not just discipline, but sorrow. The look of someone who carried secrets too heavy for words. "Tell me the truth," he whispered. She shook her head slowly. "The truth isn't mine to give." Silence filled the room. Finally, Reynolds leaned back, the decision forming like steel in his chest. He exhaled, long and heavy. "Fine. Then my report will stand as written. No deviations." Carter's shoulders eased slightly. She nodded once, then turned to leave. At the door, she paused, glancing back. "Thank you, sir," she said quietly. And then she was gone. Days later, Reynolds submitted his after-action report. Sterile, clinical, nothing unusual noted. Carter's name appeared only once, buried among the squad list. The file was stamped, archived, and forgotten. But Reynolds knew the truth. Carter wasn't forgotten. She was never meant to be remembered in the first place. As he stood on the parade ground that evening, watching his soldiers drill under the crimson sunset, he saw Carter among them, silent, efficient, invisible. To the rest, she was just another specialist. But to him, she was the ghost in their ranks. And as much as it unsettled him, he knew he had made the only choice he could. Silence. For in the end, silence was the only protection left for her, for his men, and for himself.